Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We are going to jump right into the year 885. You are looking at a deeply fractured geopolitical map. We are in the Caucasus, which is a rugged, mountainous region forming a natural land bridge between Europe and Asia.
Yeah, a highly strategic location.
Right. And for over 4 centuries, the local Armenian population has lived under the shadow of foreign rule. To the west, you have the Byzantine Empire, which is this centralized bureaucratic juggernaut. And to the south and east, you have the Abbasid Caliphate, an Islamic superpower stretching from North Africa all the way to the borders of India. And right in the middle, caught directly in the crosshairs of these two massive hostile entities, is a local prince named Ashot I.
Right in the middle of it all.
Exactly. Now, by all the normal rules of historical gravity, his territory should be crushed. I mean, it should be assimilated or just turned into a permanent smoldering battlefield. But instead, he pulls off this diplomatic high-wire act that really defies belief. In 885, Ashot I receives a royal crown from the Abbasid Caliph. And at virtually the exact same time, he gets formal recognition and a royal crown from the Byzantine Emperor. Two bitter rivals, mutually agreeing to recognize a newly sovereign Armenian state.
The sheer audacity of that moment is, well, it's deeply compelling. The Bagratuni family, which Ashot belonged to, they managed to reestablish an Armenian monarchy after a 450-year interregnum.
Which is a massive gap.
Well, absolutely. They essentially forced the leaders of the Islamic world and the Christian Orthodox world to look at the map and conclude that an independent sovereign Armenia was actually, in both of their best interests.
Right.
But to fully grasp how Ashot I orchestrated that crowning moment, we need to wind the clock back. We have to look at the massive political vacuum that the Bagratunis spent generations quietly filling.
Right, because kingdoms do not just materialize out of thin air, right? Especially between empires. So let's trace this back. The last independent Armenian kingdom, the Abbasid dynasty, collapsed in the year 428. Following that, you have this period of intense instability leading up to the Arab conquests of the 640s. The armies of the nascent Islamic Caliphate sweep through the region, and this entire territory gets incorporated into the Umayyad Caliphate and later the Abbasid Caliphate as a massive administrative province they called Armenia.
Yeah, and the creation of that province is crucial to understand. The Arab rulers were expanding at a blistering pace. I mean, they were conquering vast stretches of territory from Spain to Persia.
Right, huge amounts of land.
Exactly. And when you expand that quickly, you run into a fundamental problem of logistics and manpower. You simply do not have enough soldiers or administrators to, put a garrison in every single mountain valley and dictate the daily lives of the local population.
Right.
So the Caliphate adopted a highly pragmatic system of semi-autonomy for the province of Armenia.
They realized they just cannot micromanage a mountainous region full of deeply entrenched local families.
Exactly the calculation. So they installed an Arab governor, known as an Ostican, who operated out of the city of Drevin. And the Ostican was the ultimate representative of the Caliph. His job was to ensure the taxes were collected and that the region didn't actively rebel.
Make sure the money flows.
Yeah, keep the peace and collect the tribute. But beneath that top layer of imperial administration, the day-to-day governance, the actual control of the land, the peasants, local justice that was left in the hands of the traditional Armenian princes, these were the ancient noble families known as the Nakar.
So it operates almost like a massive protection racket or a suzerain vassal system. The Caliphate says, you pay us our tribute, you supply troops when we need them for our wider campaigns, and in exchange, we let you keep your titles, your castles, and your immediate authority over your own people.
That is a very apt way to describe the power dynamic. And this decentralized environment is really the soil in which the Bagratuni family planted their seeds for the future. You see, the Bagratunis were not newcomers. They were an ancient house, tracing their lineage all the way back to the Orontid dynasty, which ruled centuries before the Common Era.
Very deep roots.
Very deep. And within the traditional hierarchy of the Nakara, the Bagratunis held some very specific, highly prestigious hereditary titles.
Right. The sources mention 2 major titles. One is the Aspet, which translates roughly to the commander of the cavalry, and the other is the Tagadir.
Yeah, and the Tagadir is arguably the more symbolic of the two. It translates to the coronet.
The coronet, meaning?
Meaning they held the hereditary privilege of physically placing the crown on the head of the king during the old Abbasid dynasty. So even though there hadn't been a king for centuries, the Bagratuni still carried this aura of royal proximity. They were the kingmakers of old. They possessed a deep, ingrained cultural authority among the other noble families.
I mean, having an impressive resume and an old title is nice, but it doesn't protect you from a sword, right? The Caliphate was not known for indulging local lords who stepped out of line.
No, they were not.
And the other noble families surely wanted that top spot. So how did the Bagratunis survive the constant infighting?
Well, they survived through a masterful application of strategic patience. To really understand their rise, you have to look at the destruction of their main rivals.
Yeah.
In the 770s, several prominent Armenian noble families decided they had had enough of Arab taxation and rule.
Okay.
The most powerful of these families was the Mamikonian house. They orchestrated a massive, all-out military rebellion against the Abbasid Caliphate.
Which, I mean, given the size of the Abbasid military at that time, seems like a deeply miscalculated gamble.
Oh, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Abbasids brought down the hammer. The rebellion was utterly crushed in a series of brutal battles. The Mamikonian family, along with several other prominent Nakhar houses, were decimated. Their lands were confiscated, their military retinues were destroyed, and their political power was just permanently broken.
And what were the Bagratunis doing while their rivals were getting wiped out?
Sitting on the sidelines.
Just watching?
Just watching. The Bagratunis explicitly chose not to participate in the 70s rebellion. They assessed the geopolitical reality, realized a localized revolt could not defeat the entire caliphate, and opted for self-preservation. When the smoke cleared, the Bagratunis emerged completely intact. Their military strength was undiminished, and, more importantly, the power vacuum left by the destruction of the Mamikonians was theirs to fill.
That is cold, calculating politics. They just let their rivals commit political suicide and then swept up the pieces.
It was a strategy of steady, relentless accumulation. Over the next few decades, they bought up the confiscated lands of the ruined families, they expanded their economic base, and they proved to the Arab Ostican and Dravan that they were reliable, pragmatic administrators who could keep the peace and, deliver the taxes.
Right.
This culminated in the year 806, when a Bagratuni leader who carried the rather intimidating moniker of Ashot the Carnivore managed to secure the formal position of presiding prince from the Abbasid Caliph.
Ashot the Carnivore. That name implies he was not just quietly filing tax returns, right? He was aggressively consuming the territories around him.
Definitely.
But getting the title of presiding prince is still just being the top manager for the empire. It is not true sovereignty. That final leap takes another 80 years, leading us to Ashot I in 885.
And that leap required a massive shift in the broader global landscape. The Bagratunis could not break free solely on their own strength. They needed the empires around them to weaken. By the late 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was experiencing a severe internal crisis. They were dealing with the Zanj Rebellion.
Let's unpack that because it is vital context for this deep dive. The Zanj Rebellion was not just a minor border skirmish, right?
Far from it. The Zanj Rebellion was a massive uprising of enslaved people, primarily of East African descent, who were forced to work in the grueling salt marshes of southern Iraq. This rebellion broke out in 869 and lasted for 15 years.
15 years?
Yes, it was a brutal, exhausting conflict that took place right in the agricultural heartland of the Caliphate, dangerously close to their capital. It completely drained the Abbasid treasury and tied up their best military commanders.
So the Caliph, al-Mu'tamid, is bleeding resources trying to put down this massive rebellion in his own backyard. The last thing he wants or can afford is for his northern frontier, the province of Armenia, to erupt into a full-scale war of independence.
Precisely. The Caliph realized his grip on the periphery was slipping. He knew Ashot I had consolidated immense local power. If the Caliph pushed Ashot too hard, or tried to extract too much tribute to fund the Zanj War, Ashot would simply defect and ally his military forces with the Byzantine Empire.
Which brings us to the view from Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Basil I, is looking eastward. Why does he decide to endorse Ashot instead of just, trying to conquer Armenia himself while the Arabs are distracted?
Well, Basil I was an astute strategist. The Byzantines had spent centuries fighting, grinding, costly wars against Arab incursions along their eastern frontier. Basil recognized that trying to directly conquer and hold the rugged Armenian highlands would stretch Byzantine supply lines and drain their own treasury.
The mountains are just too hard to hold.
Right. Instead, he saw the value of a strong, friendly buffer state. If Ashot I was recognized as an independent Christian king, his kingdom would serve as a massive physical and military shield for the Byzantine border.
So it is an incredibly precarious balancing act. Both empires calculate that an independent Bagratid Armenia, friendly to them, is vastly preferable to an Armenia controlled entirely by their enemy.
Exactly.
It is like two vicious neighborhood crime syndicates mutually agreeing to let a local business operate independently, purely because neither wants to risk an all-out street war over the territory while they are dealing with their own internal problems.
That captures the dynamic very well. Ashot I played them against each other flawlessly. He sent assurances of friendship and regular tribute to the Caliph, securing the Abbasid crown. And concurrently, he emphasized his shared Christian faith and strategic utility to the Byzantines, securing their royal recognition. He essentially manifested a kingdom out of the mutual apprehension of two superpowers.
Okay, so we have established the political birth of the kingdom. The treaties are signed, the crowns are delivered, but treaties are just pieces of parchment. They only last as long as the military force capable of defending the borders they outline.
Right.
This brings us to the physical reality of the kingdom. Let us look at the armor of the realm, the feudal structure, and the military logistics that kept the Bagratids alive.
The defining characteristic of the Bagratid state was its extreme decentralization. The kingdom was not a monolithic, unified entity with a singular, sprawling bureaucracy. The Nakhara system, which had sustained them under Arab rule, continued.
Okay.
The various local princes and lords recognized the Bagratid king's supreme authority primarily for matters of foreign policy, war, and peace.
But internally, they ran their own lands.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, over the centuries, the realm fragmented into several distinct sub-kingdoms. You had the central Bagratid domain, but then you had interconnected but semi-autonomous regions like Kars, Lori, Sunik, Artsakh, and Vespurakan. Each of these sub-kingdoms had its own ruling family, its own local administration, and its own military retinues.
This sounds inherently unstable. If you compare it to the Byzantine Empire next door, the contrast is stark, right?
Very stark.
Because the Byzantines had a massive, centrally funded standing army. The emperor in Constantinople collected taxes from the entire empire, put the gold in a central treasury, and used it to pay, equip, and feed professional soldiers. The Bagratid king does not have that luxury.
No, the Bagratid king relies entirely on a suzerain vassal system. When a threat appeared on the horizon, the king would send out the call, and the various Nakhar would muster their personal forces and ride to join the royal banner. And despite this fragmented approach, the sources indicate they could muster a formidable field army of between 40,000 to 60,000 troops.
Which is a massive force for a decentralized medieval state.
It really is.
And the core of that military power, the tip of the spear, was the Ashot cavalry.
Yes, the Ashot. They were the professional, land-owning, noble warriors. They were the elite, heavy cavalry. Because the central state was not providing their gear, outfitting a single Ashot warrior required immense personal wealth. The archaeological and textual sources give us incredible detail on their equipment. This was not a light skirmishing force. They were heavily armored shock troops.
Let us get into the specifics of that gear because the metallurgy and craftsmanship involved are intense. They wore lamellar armor. For you listening and trying to visualize this, lamellar consists of hundreds of small, rectangular plates of iron or bronze overlapping each other.
The construction of lamellar armor is really fascinating. Traditionally, these small metal plates were laced together using thick leather cords or heavy silk thread. This allowed the armor to be flexible, moving with the rider. However, by the late 10th century, we see a significant technological evolution in the region. Armenian craftsmen began using metal rivets instead of laces to fasten the plates together.
Why make that shift? What does riveting achieve that lacing does not?
It drastically improves the impact resistance and durability of the armor. Leather laces, no matter how thick, can be slashed by a drawing cut from a sword, or they can rot and degrade from sweat and weather. If a lace snaps, a whole section of plates can fall away, exposing the warrior.
Which is fatal.
Exactly. Metal rivets lock the plates firmly in place, distributing the kinetic energy of a blow much more effectively across the entire chess piece.
And the offensive weaponry is just as specialized. They carried composite bows, long spears for the initial charge, and straight, double-edged swords forged from high-carbon bullet steel.
Ah, bullet steel.
Right. Bullet steel is renowned for its specific smelting process, which results in a highly durable, incredibly sharp edge that can withstand the trauma of striking heavy armor without shattering.
And the protection extended beyond the rider. The horses themselves were heavily armored, a practice known as barding. The sources describe horses equipped with articulated metal plates covering their faces, their necks, and their chests. They even utilized smaller, overlapping copper plates to protect the vulnerable belly of the horse from upward spear thrusts by infantry.
The sheer physics of this are daunting. The records suggest that a full suit of lamellar or scale armor could weigh anywhere from 14 to 16 kilograms.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah. Add the weight of the weapons, the shield, and the massive armor on the horse itself, and you are looking at an immense amount of mass. This requires a level of physical conditioning and dedicated lifelong training that only a wealthy, noble class exempt from agricultural labor could possibly maintain.
The Abbasid spent their entire lives training to fight in this specific manner. They were walking, riding fortresses.
But here is where I see a major geographical contradiction. Anyone who has looked at a map of the Caucasus knows it is defined by rugged, towering mountains, deep ravines, and narrow valleys. It is not the Eurasian steppe.
No, it's not.
Why would an army operating in the mountains rely so heavily on armored heavy cavalry? Usually, heavy cavalry requires wide, flat, open plains to build up the momentum for a charge. In a mountain pass, heavy cavalry seems like a massive liability.
It does seem counterintuitive at first glance, but it makes perfect sense when you understand the specific tactical doctrine of the Armenian commanders.
Yeah.
Their primary adversaries, initially the Arab armies and later the various Turkic nomadic groups, relied heavily on light horse archers.
Yeah.
These were incredibly fast, lightly armored riders who excelled at hit-and-run tactics. On an open plain, those light horse archers would simply ride circles around the heavily armored Abbasid, peppering them with arrows and exhausting their horses without ever engaging in close combat.
So the Armenian commanders knew they would lose a war of maneuver on flat ground.
Exactly. So they used the mountains to dictate the terms of the engagement. The Armenian generals deliberately avoided open plains. They utilized their intimate knowledge of the local geography to force bottlenecks. They would orchestrate feigned retreats or block alternative routes, drawing the enemy forces into a narrow mountain pass or a steep-sided valley.
They turned the geography into a funnel.
A deadly funnel. Once the enemy's light cavalry was drawn into a tight space, their primary advantage, their mobility, was completely neutralized. They could no longer ride out of range. They could no longer flank. At that precise moment, the Armenian heavy cavalry would engage.
Right, because now it's just a brawl.
Yes. In brutal, close-quarters combat within a confined space, the heavy lamellar armor and the high-carbon bulla steel swords provided a distinct, overwhelming advantage. The light horsemen simply could not penetrate the Abbasid armor in a melee, while the Abbasid could carve right through them.
So they weaponized the landscape itself. But maintaining a military machine of that caliber brings us to a fundamental problem of economics. Outfitting tens of thousands of noble cavalrymen and barding their horses with riveted iron, bronze, and copper requires an astronomical amount of capital.
It certainly does.
You cannot simply tax local subsistence farmers enough wheat and barley to pay for high-carbon steel swords. This transitions us to the economic engine of Bagratid Armenia, and specifically its crown jewel, the metropolis of Anne.
The geographic location of the kingdom provided the solution to the financial problem. Bagratid Armenia was situated exactly astride the major overland trade routes that linked the Byzantine Empire in the west, the Abbasid Caliphate in the south, and the broader Caucasus to the north and east. This was a vital, pulsating branch of the Silk Road.
Right.
Vast quantities of goods moving from East Asia, India, and Persia toward the markets of Europe frequently passed through these very mountain valleys.
The administrative center of the kingdom actually moved several times in the early decades. The royal court shifted from Bagaran to Shirakavan and then to Kars. It seems they were searching for the perfect strategic location. Finally, in the year 961, King Ashot III established the capital at a site called Ani.
And Ani grew at an explosive, almost unprecedented rate. Within a few decades, it transformed from a regional fortress into a sprawling metropolis. Estimates suggest the population swelled to nearly 100,000 people.
Which is huge for the time.
To put that in perspective, at the turn of the first millennium, a population of 100,000 rivaled or even exceeded major European capitals like Paris or London.
It was a megacity of the medieval world, and it was situated in a highly defensible position. Ani was built on a triangular plateau. Two sides of the city were protected by the deep, sheer gorge carved by the Akurian River. For the third side, the only flat approach, the kings built massive, dual stone walls reinforced with immense towers.
But the walls were just the shell. The internal economic mechanics of this wealth are deeply compelling. One of the most notable aspects of Bagratid Armenia is that they did not have an indigenous currency. The kings did not mint their own standard widespread coinage with their faces on it, which is, usually the first thing a new kingdom does to assert sovereignty.
If they didn't have their own money, how did the markets function? How do you buy a loaf of bread or a bolt of silk in a city of 100,000 people?
They utilized the currencies of the empires around them. The archaeological excavations at Ani have unearthed massive hoards of foreign coins. The markets operated using Arab dirhams, the standard silver coins of the Caliphate and Byzantine numismata, the gold coins of the empire.
Ah, I see.
The Bagratids recognized that creating a new, localized currency would actually introduce friction into international trade. By using the established global reserve currencies, they made it incredibly easy for foreign merchants to do business in Ani.
They leaned into globalization. But this raises an obvious question about the timeline. The Silk Road existed for centuries before the Bagratids came to power. The geography didn't change. If they were situated on such lucrative trade routes, why did it take until the late 10th century for this massive urban boom to occur?
It comes down to the necessity of geopolitical stability. Trade caravans, loaded with fortunes in silk, spices, and silver, absolutely avoid active war zones. For centuries, the Armenian highlands have been a relentless battleground between the Byzantines and the Arabs. The roads were dangerous, local lords were unpredictable, and the risk of a caravan being seized by an invading army was immense. Consequently, the major trade routes bypassed the region whenever possible.
But the dual crown diplomacy of 885 changed that calculation.
Exactly. When Ashot I and his successors established those treaties, they effectively neutralized the region. They created a secure, reliable buffer state. They implemented strict laws protecting merchants, built caravanserais for safe lodging, and organized patrols to keep the mountain passes clear of bandits.
Safe travel means more business.
Right. Once the merchant networks realized that the route through Ani was safe, reliable, and faster than the alternatives, the trade flooded in. The Bagratid kings also smartly lowered the transit tolls and tariffs to undercut competing routes.
But the true genius of their economy, it wasn't just collecting a toll at the city gate and hoarding the silver, right? The sources emphasize the concept of merchant capital. The urban elite of Ani did not act merely as passive toll collectors. They actively captured the wealth flowing through the city and aggressively reinvested it into local production.
And that reinvestment strategy is what turned Ani from a simple way station into a self-sustaining economic powerhouse. The wealthy merchants and the Nakar began funding large-scale agricultural and manufacturing infrastructure right outside the city walls. For example, they financed the construction of massive industrial oil mills.
The production of linseed oil was huge. They grew massive quantities of flax in the surrounding plains. They harvested the seeds, brought them to the city, and used heavy stone presses powered by animals or water to extract the oil.
And that linseed oil had multiple high-value applications. It was the primary fuel used for illumination in the city's thousands of lamps. It was a crucial binding agent used in the production of high-quality manuscript paper and parchment. Furthermore, they invested heavily in metalwork foundries, large-scale pottery kilns, and most significantly, textile manufacturing.
They were taking the raw materials passing through the city and turning them into finished luxury goods.
Precisely. By manufacturing high-value goods locally, they drastically altered the balance of trade. Instead of just taxing a merchant carrying Byzantine silk to Persia, they began producing their own celebrated Armenian textiles, utilizing the local dyes and wool and selling them directly into the international market.
So they keep the profits at home.
Yeah, the value of the human labor expended to produce those goods was realized entirely within the economy of Ani. The profits from those local industries were then pumped right back into the city's infrastructure, creating a positive feedback loop of immense wealth generation.
Which leads us directly to the physical manifestation of that wealth. When you have a massive influx of merchant capital, a booming population, and a desire to project permanence, you channel that wealth into stone. We are transitioning now to the cultural and architectural legacy of the city, which became widely known in the medieval world as the City of 40 Gates and the City of 1001 Churches.
The visual impact of Ani must have been just massive. The entire metropolis was built from a local volcanic rock known as tufa. Tufa is a truly remarkable building material. It is formed from compacted volcanic ash. When it is first quarried from the earth, it's relatively soft and damp. Masons can carve it easily with iron tools, creating incredibly intricate, lace-like details.
It doesn't stay soft?
No, not at all. Once it is exposed to the air and the sun, the moisture evaporates and the stone calcifies, hardening into an incredibly durable, weather-resistant shell. Furthermore, tufa has excellent insulating properties, which was vital for surviving the harsh, freezing winters of the Armenian plateau.
Right, because it gets incredibly cold there.
Exactly. But perhaps its most striking feature is its color palette. Tufa occurs naturally in vibrant, striking shades, creamy yellow, deep rose red, and jet black.
The builders didn't just use whatever color was closest. They deliberately quarried different colors to create stunning polychrome patterns on the facades of the buildings. They would alternate rows of red and black stone, creating a visual rhythm that made the massive structures look almost weightless. The scale of the construction is hard to fathom. Archaeologists have excavated 50 major churches, 33 cave chapels carved directly into the gorge, and countless palaces, baths, and commercial buildings.
But the undisputed pinnacle of this architectural explosion is the Cathedral of Ani.
The cathedral is a masterpiece. Construction started in the year 989 under the patronage of King Simbat II. The project was entrusted to a celebrated Armenian architect named Chalat.
Yes, Turdat.
He was so renowned that he was later called to Constantinople to repair the dome of the Hagia Sophia after an earthquake. The Cathedral of Ani was completed in 1001 under the rule of Queen Katrinide.
And the architectural significance of what Turdat achieved in the Cathedral of Ani really cannot be overstated by architectural historians.
Yeah.
When you walk through the massive portals and look at the interior structure, you immediately notice two defining features: pointed arches and clustered piers.
Okay, clustered piers.
Yeah, the clustered piers are columns composed of several smaller, attached shafts, which draw the eye upward. These structural elements give the interior a profound sense of verticality and a soaring, weightless quality.
These are the exact structural components that define the great European Gothic cathedrals, like Notre Dame or Chartres.
Exactly. But the Cathedral of Ani was completed in 1001. This predates the emergence of Gothic architecture in Western Europe by well over a century. The engineers and masons of the Bagratid court were experimenting with and mastering structural forms that would later define the religious architecture of the entire European continent.
It represents a highly significant level of innovation. And it wasn't occurring in a vacuum. Ani was a deeply cosmopolitan hub, constantly absorbing and synthesizing the cultures flowing along the trade routes. You see this vividly in another major structure, King Gagic's Church of St. Gregory.
This church was completed around 1005, designed to be a massive, circular, three-tiered structure modeled after the older, famous Zvartnots Cathedral.
What makes this church so fascinating for our discussion is an artifact discovered during the excavations in 1906. Archaeologists digging in the ruins unearthed a massive 2.26-meter-tall statue of King Gagic I himself. It originally stood high on the facade of the church.
The depiction of the king on that statue is highly revealing, and it forces us to reconsider how these rulers viewed themselves and their place in the world.
Right, let us paint the visual of this statue. You have a Christian Armenian king. His arms are outstretched, holding a heavy stone model of the very church he built, offering it up to God. So far, very standard Christian iconography. But look at what he is wearing. He is not wearing a Byzantine tunic. He is not wearing traditional Roman armor. He is wearing a large, voluminous Islamic turban. And his body is draped in a halat, a very specific type of traditional sweeping robe. What does this profound sartorial choice say about the identity of the Bagratid rulers?
It speaks to a deeply pragmatic, calculated cosmopolitanism. The khalat was not just a piece of clothing you bought in the market. In the diplomatic protocol of the Abbasid Caliphate, receiving a khalat was a formal act of investiture.
Oh, interesting.
It was a garment of honor bestowed by the caliph himself, signifying political recognition, alliance, and legitimacy within the broader Islamic political sphere.
So by wearing it on a Christian monument, he isn't secretly converting or hiding his faith. He is broadcasting his diplomatic untouchability.
Precisely. Wearing the turban and the khalat on the facade of his greatest church was an assertion of political reality. It showed every merchant, ambassador, and spy who entered Ani that Gagic I was formally recognized and protected by the highest authorities of the Islamic world.
It's a statement.
A huge statement. It added immense prestige to his rule within his own multicultural metropolis. The population of Ani wasn't just Armenian Christians. There were Persian merchants, Arab traders, Jewish communities, and Byzantine diplomats. The statue is a visual representation of the exact geopolitical balancing act that created the kingdom in 885. He is literally wearing his foreign policy.
And the cultural output extended far beyond architecture and sculpture. The wealth and stability of the Bagratid era fueled a renaissance in Armenian Ta art.
Ta were highly intricate musical and poetic compositions. They were incredibly complex rhythmic structures exploring themes of spiritual devotion, love, and nature. The monasteries around Ani became massive centers of manuscript illumination, translation, and historical writing. The intellectual output was just massive, creating a distinct, vibrant cultural ecosystem.
The kingdom reached its absolute territorial and economic zenith under King Gagik I, ruling from 989 to 1020. The borders stretched from the fortress of Shamkor in the east all the way to the Kura River. They had a booming metropolis, a wealthy noble cavalry, and the recognition of empires. They seemed invincible.
They really did.
Yet, as we move to the next phase of this history, we find that the seeds of their destruction were already deeply embedded in their own foundation.
The collapse of Bagratid Armenia was startlingly sudden. It did not experience a long, slow, multi-century decline. It fractured and broke over the course of just a few decades, and the fatal flaw was internal. Following the death of King Gagik I in 1020, the kingdom immediately plunged into a severe succession crisis between his two sons, Ahasismat III and Ashot IV.
Rather than one brother definitively taking the throne and unifying the state, they rely on an old Bagratid tradition.
Yes, the tradition of partible inheritance dividing lands and titles among male heirs. Instead of preserving the centralized authority that Gagik I had fought so hard to build, the brothers divided the realm. They established semi-eponymous, bitterly rival principalities.
This brings us back to the Nakaris system we discussed earlier. The exact same decentralized feudal structure that allowed the Armenian nobles to survive the Arab occupation by avoiding centralized decapitation now proved to be a lethal liability.
Exactly.
When the central authority fractured between the brothers, the local princes retreated to their mountain fortresses, prioritizing their local power and petty grievances over the unified governance of the kingdom.
They lost the ability to coordinate, and they lost it at the exact moment the geopolitical weather began to turn against them. The Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Basil II, was at the height of its military resurgence. The Byzantines saw the internal chaos in Armenia not as a threat to their buffer state, but as an opportunity for expansion. They applied immense military and diplomatic pressure on the divided kingdom.
The internal strife and Byzantine intimidation reached such a fever pitch that in the year 1022, King Ahasismat committed a stunning act of capitulation. He actually signed a treaty, effectively a will, promising to cede his entire kingdom to the Byzantine Empire upon his death.
It was a desperate attempt to buy time and secure Byzantine backing against his brother and domestic rivals, but it sealed the fate of the realm. When Ahasismat died, the Byzantine machinery ground into motion. By 1045, the new Byzantine emperor, Constantine IX, summoned the last Bagratid king, Gagik II, who was just a teenager, to Constantinople under the guise of diplomatic negotiations.
And once he was in the capital, away from his armies and his fortress, they sprang the trap.
Constantine IX coerced the young king's abdication. The Byzantine army subsequently marched into Ani, formally annexing the city and dismantling the Bagratid state. The Armenian kingdom was erased from the map, absorbed into the imperial bureaucracy of Byzantium.
I have to pause here because looking at the broader map, this Byzantine strategy makes absolutely zero sense. Why would the Byzantine Empire deliberately dismantle a strong, allied Christian buffer state, a state that has spent 2 centuries successfully defending those mountain passes?
It seems baffling, right?
Yeah, especially because right at this exact moment in the 1040s, a massive new nomadic threat, the Seljuk Turks, is arriving on their eastern frontier. Tearing down your own outer shield right as a new enemy approaches seems totally irrational.
It was a catastrophic failure of grand strategy, driven entirely by dynastic opportunism and short-term greed. The Byzantine emperors of this specific period were heavily focused on immediate territorial expansion to bolster their prestige at home, and more importantly, they wanted the wealth.
The money from Ani.
Yes. Annexing Ani meant the immense, compounding merchant wealth of that Silk Road metropolis flowed directly into the Byzantine treasury in Constantinople rather than stopping in the Armenian mountains.
They wanted the tax revenue.
Exactly. And the Byzantine high command suffered from immense imperial hubris. They assumed that their massive, centrally funded imperial armies could defend the new eastern border just as effectively as the decentralized Bagratids had. They believed their heavily structured legions could hold the mountain passes.
But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the warfare in that region.
Completely. And the consequences were immediate and devastating. The Seljuk raids began probing the borders in the 1020s. The Seljuks were a formidable force. They utilized highly mobile nomadic warfare tactics, massive swarms of light horse archers moving with terrifying speed.
Which we discussed earlier.
Right. The static, heavily centralized Byzantine border defenses, reliant on infantry garrisons and slow-moving supply lines, were hopelessly ill-equipped to handle this type of highly fluid, asymmetric warfare.
The Byzantines had just dismantled the local Armenian military structures. They disbanded or exiled the Abbasid cavalry, the very men who possessed the specialized armor, the local knowledge, and the bottleneck tactics required to defeat light horsemen in the mountains.
They removed the only effective shield. The Byzantine armies suffered catastrophic defeats. The Seljuk forces poured through the mountain passes that the Bagratids had previously held shut. In 1064, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan laid siege to Ani.
A city of 100,000 people, surrounded by massive walls, faces a massive nomadic army.
The siege lasted for nearly a month, but without a coordinated field army to break the encirclement, the city was doomed. In August of 1064, the Seljuk forces breached the dual walls. The resulting sack was apocalyptic. The contemporary sources describe scenes of unimaginable terror and slaughter. The streets were choked with bodies. The wealth of a century of Silk Road trade was looted in a matter of days. The Cathedral of Ani and the hundreds of churches were stripped of their treasures.
It is a brutal, definitive end to the Bagratid political rule, but it is not the end of the physical city itself. We turn now to the long, incredibly complex twilight of Ani. The city endured a long, violent afterlife, transitioning from a medieval powerhouse to a modern ghost town.
Despite the utter devastation of the SAG in 1064, a city with that much built-in infrastructure and such a prime geographic location does not simply vanish overnight. In 1072, the Seljuks, having extracted the portable wealth, essentially sold the city. They transferred control of Ani to the Shaddadids, a Kurdish Muslim dynasty who ruled as vassals to the Seljuk Sultan.
The Shaddadids repair the walls, they convert some structures into mosques, and they try to get the trade flowing again. And the city actually experiences a notable revival. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the region comes under the control of the expanding Georgian kingdom under Queen Tamar. She grants the city to her generals, the Zakarian brothers.
Under the Zakarians, Ani experienced a final, brilliant gasp of prosperity. They rebuilt the damaged infrastructure, strengthened the defensive walls, and commissioned a flurry of new church construction. The merchant caravans temporarily returned, but the forces of history and geology were converging against them.
It was a 1-2-3 punch that permanently killed the city.
First came the Mongols. In 1236, the Mongol Empire, expanding westward with unstoppable momentum, besieged and captured Ani. The Mongol sack was devastating, profoundly damaging the city's population and commercial networks. But unlike the Seljuks, the Mongols did not leave a stable administration behind to rebuild.
Then came the geology. The region is highly seismically active. In 1319, a massive earthquake struck the Akurian Gorge.
That was the end.
Yeah, the tremor was so violent that it collapsed the massive central dome of Tridats Cathedral and severely damaged countless other buildings, infrastructure, and the water supply.
And the final fatal blow was economic. As the 14th and 15th centuries progressed, global trade routes fundamentally shifted. The rise of maritime shipping routes navigating around Africa to reach the spice markets of the East proved cheaper and safer than the arduous, politically unstable overland caravan routes through the Caucasus.
So the money just stopped flowing.
Exactly. The economic lifeblood of Ani simply dried up. By the 17th century, the city of 100,000 people, the city of 40 gates, was entirely abandoned. It was left to the wind and the snow.
It sat empty for over 200 years. But in the late 19th century, the ruins began to draw attention again. European travelers, antiquarians, and archaeologists began exploring the site. The most significant and transformative work was sponsored by the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. They sent an expedition led by the brilliant and somewhat controversial Orientalist Nikolai Marr. He excavated there from 1892 all the way to the eve of the Russian Revolution in 1917.
Marr's approach to the excavation of Ani is fascinating, and it represents a massive shift in how archaeology was conducted. He was not interested in simply digging trenches, extracting the most beautiful gold artifacts, and shipping them off to a museum in St. Petersburg to sit in a glass case.
Right, the typical colonial model of archaeology. Marr did something entirely different. They excavated entire sectors of the city streets, residential blocks, commercial bakeries. They cleared the rubble from the massive churches. But then, they actively began to rebuild. They set up a permanent local museum inside the old Mosque of Menuchir, and they constructed a purpose-built stone building on the site to house the thousands of artifacts they were finding.
Mar understood a fundamental truth about heritage. He recognized that Ani was not just a collection of dead stones. It was a potent, powerful symbol of cultural identity for the Armenian people. He wanted to integrate the ruins into the living fabric of the local community. The expedition laid plans to open a school for local children right there among the ruins. They planted trees to beautify the desolate plateau.
He was attempting to systematically resurrect a dead city. He wanted it to be a living, breathing center of scholarship and memory, rather than a sterile ruin.
But the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted again, violently ending Mar's vision. World War I erupted.
By 1918, the Ottoman forces were advancing rapidly across the Caucasus toward Ani. The archaeological team knew the site would be overrun. In a desperate, heroic effort, the archaeologist Ashot I and his colleague Joseph Orbeli frantically packed up the most critical, portable artifacts. Working against the clock, they managed to evacuate about 6,000 items, manuscripts, carvings, tools, and transport them to safety in Yerevan.
Their actions saved a massive portion of our understanding of Bagratid daily life, because almost everything they were forced to leave behind in Mar's carefully constructed museums was subsequently looted, destroyed, or scattered in the chaos of the advancing armies.
Following the end of the First World War, the fate of Ani was completely divorced from archaeology and dictated entirely by modern border politics. The treaties of Moscow and Kars in 1921 finalized the new borders between the newly formed Republic of Turkey and the Soviet Union.
And those treaties drew the border right down the middle of the Akurian River Gorge. This placed the ruins of Ani just meters inside the territory of the Republic of Turkey, staring directly across the gorge at Soviet Armenia.
The physical history became incredibly vulnerable, a pawn in a bitter nationalist struggle. In 1921, a Turkish government minister named Riza Nur sent an explicit directive to the Eastern Front commander, Kazim Karabekir. The order was chillingly clear. He demanded that the monuments of Anani be wiped off the face of the earth to erase the Armenian historical footprint in the region.
The survival of the ruins in that moment hung by a thread. Kazim Karabekir later wrote in his memoirs that he flatly refused to carry out the order, citing the historical value of the site. While the total annihilation ordered by Nur was avoided, the site suffered immense neglect and localized destruction. Much of the careful excavation work, the protective roofs, and the repairs that Nikolai Mar's team had meticulously installed were ruined.
For the next 70 years, Anani was locked in a deep freeze. During the Cold War, the Akurian River wasn't just a national border, it was the militarized front line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The ruins of Ani became a heavily restricted military zone.
You could not simply buy a ticket and walk through the city of 40 gates. Visiting required special permits from the military, photography of the ruins was strictly banned to prevent espionage, and the site was surrounded by watchtowers and barbed wire. It was a ghost city caught squarely in the crossfire of the 20th century's greatest geopolitical standoff.
It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, and the immense global tensions slightly thawed, that civilian access slowly began to open up again. Archaeologists and historians were finally allowed to return and assess the damage of a century of neglect. The long campaign for recognition culminated recently. In 2016, the archaeological site of Ani was finally designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Which brings the story of this landscape full circle. We have watched a location transition from a thriving, cosmopolitan hub of 100,000 people, pulsing with Silk Road wealth, to a casualty of shifting global trade, catastrophic earthquakes, and finally, a silent pawn in modern border conflicts.
Let us trace the entire trajectory we have covered today. We started with the Bagratunis, a resilient, calculating, noble family who utilized strategic patience to survive the destruction of their rivals. We watched Ashot I navigate the warring ambitions of the Byzantine and Abbasid empires to forge a sovereign state. We saw how they leveraged the highly specific, incredibly expensive Azat heavy cavalry to defend their mountain passes against lighter, faster armies. We explored how they captured the merchant capital of the Silk Road, refusing to just hoard the tolls but actively reinvesting in local industries like linseed oil and textiles to create a booming economic ecosystem. And we saw how that wealth built the metropolis of Ani, a city of towering tufa cathedrals and deep cosmopolitan pragmatism. But we also saw their fatal flaw.
The partible inheritance.
Right. The reliance on a fractured, decentralized feudal system meant the dynasty could not coordinate when it mattered most. They collapsed under the combined weight of Byzantine opportunism and the terrifying arrival of the Seljuk Turks, leaving their magnificent capital to be consumed by war, earthquakes, and time.
The narrative of Bagratid Armenia perfectly illustrates the intense vulnerability of physical history. The massive dual stone walls of Almani, the heavily riveted lamellar armor, the iron tools used to carve the tufa, all the physical manifestations of their power ultimately failed. The stones of Almani were fought over, besieged, sacked, shaken to the ground by the earth itself, and abandoned to the elements.
But the durability of ideas far outlasts the fragility of stone. The physical walls of Ani failed to protect the kingdom, and the massive dome of the cathedral collapsed into the Maeve. Yet the distinct intellectual and artistic output of the Bagratid era survived. The distinctive Ani school of architecture, those innovative pointed arches, the soaring clustered piers, the intricate polychrome stonework radiated outward. It permanently altered the cultural DNA of the entire region and foreshadowed the great architectural movements of Europe. The kingdom's legacy, its music, its manuscripts, and its architectural brilliance outlived the very stones that were meant to defend it.
A powerful thought to end on.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.